All right, so this is actually breaking news. The Supreme Court just ruled with a 6-3 decision, with all 6 conservatives and the 3 liberals disagreeing, that it will effectively render Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was an act that helped establish districts for racial representation. This was in part because of white politicians, white conservatives of their time after the end of the Reconstruction era, basically gerrymandered locally and nationally all black representation in political districts for the most part. So this new Supreme Court decision will start immediately. And what that means is for places like Mississippi or Louisiana, where the case was tried at, this means that now, not necessarily on racial rules, but on political leanings, states can gerrymander, which means they can redraw political districts for representation. The U.S. is a representative democracy, not a republic, a representative democracy. And as a result of that, what that means is that the U.S., particularly states on partisan lines, typically ran by Republican majorities, which are Republican majorities that are all both staffed, financed, and mostly featuring leadership by white conservative men, including the Supreme Court and all the foundations that got the current 6-3 majorities to the finish line. This means now they can effectively use race as a reason to get rid of laws that leveled the playing field. So we saw this at the end of affirmative action. We saw this at the end of a lot of like the DEI related initiatives across the board. And so in a lot of ways, this was the goal of 60 years ago. So around the 1960s as well, we saw the rise of like what we now consider the libertarian movement, but also the consolidation of conservatism as we know. One of the tenets was that effectively the white man had lost power. And you saw this almost 60 years ago to the day with the election and the failure of Barry Goldwater in 1964, who set the tone both politically and legally about what challenges should look like. So now we're seeing that result 60 years later with striking down a Section 2 of the voting, most of Section 2, not all, but most of Section 2 in the Voting Rights Act. What this means now is, like, particularly in the Deep South, places that had large black majorities, black people typically vote 89% with the same party. We have done this really since the end of the Civil War. And as a result, now white majorities, white conservative majorities can now legally use that same logic through the courts and just remove black political power. And it won't just be now, it'll be something that comes over the course of years. And so this is something that conservatives have really wanted since the 1950s and 1960s. They never wanted black representation, so now they get it. So what that means is places like Georgia, which should have 7 and 7, by 2030, if the Democrats don't win it this year, in 2026 in the governor and the Senate races, they could see another flip in which you have, instead of it being 7-7, it could be something like 14-0, right? Meaning that you have 14 conservatives, 14 Republicans representing the state of Georgia, and none from the liberal or the none from majority black districts or majority non-white districts. We see this already in North Carolina, which has a similar makeup, which has an 11-3 split, in which on paper it should be 7-7, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans in the U.S. Congress, but it's now 11-3. What this means now, though, is that the Supreme Court can be the blueprint for doing this. And so now you're going to see a lot of states like Louisiana, like Mississippi, like maybe not this year Alabama, but next year potentially Alabama, or places like Tennessee in the Deep South, and also places that have large black and large Democratic places like Texas has already done it. Florida's doing it now, where they're going to reduce both Democratic representation and primarily black and non-white, non-Republican representation. And so we're seeing this now in Texas. We're seeing this about to happen in Florida. There could be a place like Mississippi, which is one of our blackest states by percentage-wise, lose all their black representation in the U.S. Congress today. And so elections do matter. What this means going forward is it puts more pressure on this year for the Democrats to win, but also not just as a national party, but state by state. But what this also means is that if there's not enough pressure on Democrats, they also have to figure out what that loss means. And so what this loss means is that places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, even potentially Georgia, and further North Carolina and Florida, that means that it would almost be this issue of where do you allocate funds, where do you allocate resources? Because if you have no representation in Congress, if you have no representation in the Supreme Court and in the U.S. Senate, it's going to be really hard to change laws and get power once again. And so they've got to make a decision real fast. And so some states have maybe bucked with the Democratic trend. So you saw Virginia just recently pass a map through the voters, mind you, not through the state legislatures, which is what Texas and Florida are doing. They voted on it. And then that was challenged in Virginia by a Republican elected judge, which will probably be overturned anyway, as it appeals further up the courts in Virginia. But that decision in Virginia makes it now, instead of 6-5, which was gerrymandered by Republicans before that, mind you, it will now make it 10-1. So 10 Democratic districts, 1 Republican district in Virginia. You might see California go with the nuclear option, which is make all 52 of their districts Democratic, and so that's a stopgap. You may see New York have to do the same thing, and every other state in the Northeast start to adopt that same strategy. Maybe the Midwest, like Detroit, and was really going to be interesting in how that would factor in if Michigan were to do a flip as well, and Wisconsin. What does that mean if Wisconsin and Michigan were both to do the similar flip under leadership, just go completely nuclear and make their places all majority Democratic in order to combat Republican gerrymandering? But what this means for people like myself, people in the South, is that all eyes will be on Georgia this year, because Georgia actually does need to pull off this victory. There's a lot of reasons why this may not happen for the Democrats this year, but it puts a lot of emphasis on Georgia to pull this off. What this also means long term, though, is that across the United States, it's not just the U.S. Congress that's important. It's like places like, again, the state of Georgia on the state level, which, again, we have a supermajority in both the state House and the state Senate that was drawn by lines by Republicans to keep that majority. Now Republicans can do the same thing, and this could also be the same thing that dilutes local and statewide power across the Southeast, especially so in Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Florida. You can also start losing all these local reps and the people that you need for that. What that means is you can stack more courts now. You can also have more representation, even for Republicans, even if the demographics don't match. And so elections do matter. And so both elections of Trump have led us to this case. The 2016 election, in particular, when Trump delayed, through Mitch McConnell, delayed the appointment of Merrick Garland, and then stealing in 2020 Amy Coney Barrett's seat after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, to get them a 6-3 majority. So now we're at this place. It's going to be real messed up for a while, and I'm going to be clear about that. But I do think the Democrats have to win this year, and they have to win in states that's going to be really hard to win. So this basically leaves Georgia, North Carolina, and a little like South Florida for the most part to see if they can win something back. It's going to be very difficult, very hard. I know that's ranting, but I do think it's important that we talk about the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act being gone. And for Black people in particular, we spent decades and decades trying to get political power, and only for us to get it through an act and not necessarily through something more long-term like an amendment to the Constitution, which is why I think it's important now, as you talk to people who say they may have supported Trump, or they still do, or they support the Supreme Court and all the conservative decisions. All of these decisions are regressionary, meaning they are meant to take Black people back to what it was in the 1860s or the 1960s, prior to when we actually had rights and opportunities. And so, really bad day, but the glass is not quite half full, it's maybe a third full. And if we're gonna see something change, it's gonna have to start now. That's it. This is me. This is my little bud Taco. He's hot. We just got off for a long walk. So that's it.